Hello, my name is Ben Jeanette, and I'm a training coordinator with the National Center for School Safety, and this is the Illuminating Insights into School Threat Assessment Toolkit series. In this video conversation, we're joined by Dr. Melissa Reeves to discuss special considerations when conducting threat assessments for students with disabilities. As we talk about this, it's important to remember that although students with disabilities may be referred at a disproportionate rate, threat assessments done correctly with a problem-solving mentality rather than punitive will protect students from inappropriate discipline. Thank you, Dr. Reeves, for joining us today to discuss this. Can you take a moment and introduce yourself to our viewers?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I actually started off my career as trained as a special education teacher. I then went on and got my master's degree in counseling psychology, so I'm also a licensed professional counselor, and then spent over 20 plus years actually as a school psychologist and also as a district coordinator of social, emotional, and behavioral services. School crisis actually became a passion of mine dating all the way back to when the Columbine tragedy occurred. I was actually one of the responders to that. And that was really what put my career path on the trajectory of school safety, and particularly in the threat assessment world is, how do we notice these indicators and how do we prevent these kinds of things from happening? But most importantly is we do know that there is a disproportionate number of students with disabilities that are often referred to the threat assessment process. Now, some of that is not surprising because some of those disabilities might be related to, emotional dysregulation. But what is so critically important is to make sure that we are doing the threat assessment in a way that is very disability sensitive so we don't have disproportionality in the outcomes. So really that whole intersection of threat assessment and my background in special ed is really what has kind of brought me to the table here. And so it's a passion of mine to make sure that we are taking these disability considerations and integrating that into the threat assessment process.
That's so great to hear about your passion about this and making sure that we understand those intersections. What are some key considerations school officials should have when a threat assessment involves a student with disabilities?
Yeah. One of the most important things is you need to make sure that you have special education representation on that threat assessment team. So that could be the school psychologist, it could be the special education teacher, the special education coordinator, but it needs to be somebody that not only has expertise with the particular disability that that student has been identified with, or even if they have a suspected disability, we highly recommend that you have that representation on the team, but it's also someone that has expertise in special education law and procedures because we want to make sure that we are not violating any special education laws or protocols that need to be followed. The other important piece is also we need to make sure that that representation understands what that student's baseline behavior is because we don't want to overuse the threat assessment process if this is behavior that is relatively consistent with baseline, and we are currently already addressing those concerns within their IEP programming. So we talk a lot about that initial triage or that screening. And one of the big questions we ask for those with identified disabilities is this consistent with baseline behaviors? And are we already effectively addressing that? If we are, then we do not necessarily need to go to full assessment every single time. Now, if it's inconsistent with baseline behaviors or there's other escalating concerns, then a threat assessment may be warranted and appropriate. But to make that determination, you have to have someone that really understand what is that student's present level of functioning, what are those baseline behaviors. The other big question, and we'll kind of get into this more when we talk about manifestation determination reviews, is the current IEP plan being implemented with fidelity? Because if it's not, then we might find ourselves needing to do a manifestation determination review. Or could the behaviors of concern be more related to the fact that we're not doing what we need to do to implement their support plan? And therefore, we would need to look at better implementation than necessarily identifying these behaviors as threatening. We also have many students with disabilities that have, like, for example, some sensory issues. So, interviewing the student is a huge component to the threat assessment process. But are we setting up that interview environment to be sensitive to their sensory needs? So, for example, if they have sensory needs, you don't want to be putting them in a room with fluorescent lighting, a lot of background noise, people walking by, because that's only going to increase anxiety, or they may be struggling so much to manage the sensory input that they're not able to really engage in the interview. And then sometimes those behaviors are misinterpreted as, well, they're being non-compliant or they're being oppositional defiant because they're not answering the questions. And it's like, no, the environment is set up in a way that is not conducive to really meeting their disability needs. One of the other important key considerations is also understanding that many students with disabilities may have some language processing challenges. So if they have a receptive language processing challenge, when you ask questions, they need more time to process the question. What exactly is it you're asking? If they have expressive language challenges, they need more time to formulate, okay, what is it I want to say? Or they might be better off conveying through written, statement, or through drawing a picture and then telling us about the picture. But it's really, again, making sure that within that threat assessment process, we have that proper representation on the team that can speak to their individual needs, and then making sure that we are addressing those needs within the threat assessment process.
Great. One of the things that you brought up was possibly the use of the student's resource teacher. How can the student's resource teacher be integrated into the threat assessment process to kind of enhance the team understanding and provide that student advocacy?
One of the important things we want to do is whether that resource teacher is actually a formal member of the threat assessment team who's been trained in threat assessment, or we are interviewing that teacher as one of the data points, is we really want to get their insight into, what are the current baseline behaviors? Have these challenges been something that the student has been struggling with for a period of time, or is this a new behavior that we need to be concerned about? It's also understanding how that student interacts with others within the school building and with other peers, because many times what we see is what we refer to as reactive aggression. For those that have identified disabilities, is they don't really want to harm anyone, but we know they're oftentimes on the receiving end of teasing and bullying from some of their peers, or being ostracized by their peers. And so, is this behavior more reactive in response to an antecedent? But also, that teacher can help identify their strengths. So, how do we identify their strengths and engage their strengths within the threat assessment process, and possibly help teach some, for example, replacement behaviors that can better help them regulate or manage some of the challenge that might be the antecedents to some of the concerning behaviors. So really that teacher, or really anyone who knows that student well and is helping to provide services, just provides tremendous insight in helping us appropriately understand the behaviors and put them into the appropriate context, but most importantly, really helping with that management and support planning if it's warranted.
That's a great integration for such a powerful resource for the threat assessment team. You mentioned earlier the manifestation determination hearings. What part do they play in the threat assessment process, and when should they be held?
That this is always the $1 million question that we get. First of all, what is really important is that we do not need to do a manifestation determination review, or we refer to them as MDRs, every single time we do a threat assessment on a student with an identified disability. But there are certain times where one would be warranted. So first of all, what an MDR is it's a meeting that schools are required to hold when they're considering excluding a student with a disability that could constitute a change of placement. And this is something that is required by the Individuals with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And that MDR would need to be held within 10 school days of a decision to change that student's placement. Now, what that MDR includes is a review team, which does include the parent or guardian. And basically, the big question they're asking is, are the behaviors related to the disability or potentially caused by the failure to implement the IEP? So they would be looking at, the current files, they'd be doing records reviews, observations, looking at that current IEP and or 504 plan if there's one in place. Are we implementing this with fidelity? And then really making the determination, is this behavior related to the disability or not? Now, when do we need to do an MDR? We only need to do an MDR if we're looking at a significant change of placement and the student is going to be excluded for more than 10 consecutive school days or more than 10 cumulative school days within a school year. So that's often referred to as what we call the 10-day rule. So, for example, if the student has demonstrated some previous behaviors, and they've only been, either in school or out of school suspended for 2 days. And this current concern, we're considering another 2-day suspension. For example, that's only 4 days, right? We would not need to do an MDR at that point. But the minute you reach 10 days or accumulation of 10 days, doesn't matter if it's in school suspension, out of school suspension, or you send them home, doesn't matter what you call it. If they're removed, it's when it meets that 10-day rule that it then would activate needing to do that MDR. Now, if the team determines that that behavior is a manifestation of their disability, then typically a change in placement is generally prohibited, meaning we cannot further, disconnect them or suspend or expel them for that behavior. What we basically would be doing is, going back and looking at their current plan. And are there any changes in programming or services that need to happen? If we've not done a functional behavioral assessment and developed a behavior intervention or support plan, we would need to do so. But if it is related to their disability, that's the course of action that would need to be taken. If the team determines within the MDR that it's not a manifestation of the disability, then the school can proceed with disciplinary actions as they would for any other student, but they still need to make sure that they are meeting the educational needs. So in other words, that student is still entitled to a free and appropriate education, and we might need to modify the IEP to be reflective of what that new setting may be. Also, if they are under a 504, and they're found solely eligible under a 504, then ADA would permit all educational services to cease. We could consider a change of placement, but if we're going to do that, there are many educational lawyers that argue we really should then be conducting a psychoeducational evaluation first to determine if they could qualify for educational services under IDEA, and therefore an IEP may better meet their needs than some significant discipline or a significant change of placement. So I know that's a lot of information, and that's also why it's critically important to have that special education representation on the team, because they're the ones that would be going, whoa, wait a minute, we now need to do an MDR, and based upon that decision, it could impact the management planning through the threat assessment process. They can help bring that intersection to the table.
You did talk a little bit about how a manifestation might affect the outcome of what happens in the threat assessment, but specifically, how does that outcome of the manifestation determination influence the interventions the team may choose to implement?
Mhm. Well, the outcomes of the MDR basically determine, is that student going to stay put in their current setting because it is a manifestation? And therefore, we might need to look more at just changes in their programming and services versus if it's not a manifestation, then those disciplinary actions could be taken and potentially a change of placement could be warranted. So that's why that outcome of that MDR really does impact the next steps that we would take through that management and those interventions and supports. But as I always like to say, is that disconnecting kids or further isolating them from their least restrictive environment does not necessarily make any of us safer. And it can lead to a lot of what I refer to as unintended consequences. When we are removing them from their least restrictive environment or separating them from their peer groups and from access to in-person daily instruction, we do run the risk of them falling further and further behind academically and with their social emotional development. So, really, the whole goal of threat assessment is how do we keep them connected as much as we possibly can, and really looking at providing those appropriate interventions and supports.
That's a great point. What are some legal protections like those in Title II and III of the ADA need to be considered when assessing a potential threat involving a student with disability?
Yeah, this is really important because I'm finding out that as I go around the country and train teams, a lot of people are not aware of the fact that the threat assessment must meet the direct threat standard. Now, I would say this is just good practice for any threat assessment that we're doing, but particularly with those with identified disabilities, written into law is this direct threat standard. And basically, what that means is that the threat assessment must be an individualized assessment based upon reasonable judgment that relies on current medical knowledge or the best available objective evidence. So, like in the school, that would be, behavior, academic achievement, all of those things. And that threat assessment needs to assess, and this is what's written into law, the nature, duration, and severity of the risk, and what is the probability that the injury will occur. So, again, the difference between making a threat and posing a threat. So, because according to law, we cannot remove a student from their least restrictive environment based upon a verbal threat alone. So, in other words, in meeting that direct threat standard, your threat assessment needs to show the seriousness of the threat and that there was possible capability, intent, and accessibility to actually carry it out. And so, what this does is it does provide some protections that for our students, where dysregulation may be part of their disability, that we are not overly using punitive exclusionary measures. So, meeting that direct threat standard is you also need to prove that they posed a threat. And in addition to that, particularly if we are going to be looking at removal, we also have to show what were we doing in advance to try to prevent this escalation of behaviors. So that's going to go back to that 504 or that IEP. Were we implementing those with fidelity? Because if we were not, then no, we can't jump to exclusionary measures. So there's kind of this two-prong thing with that direct threat standard. It's we need data to show they actually pose a risk to those within the school environment, but we also need to prove that we were putting the right supports in place to try to prevent this escalation from happening. And technically, you cannot remove a student with a disability from their least restrictive environment unless you meet that direct threat standard.
That's a very, very important fact, right?
Yes.
Um, we've covered a lot of ground today and a lot of statutes. Is there anything further you'd like to add or emphasize that we haven't touched upon today in our discussion?
Yeah, one of the other things that in more serious situations is what we call IAEPs or Interim Alternative Educational Placement. Now, this is really reserved for situations that are pretty serious. For example, if a student brings a weapon on campus, they knowingly possess or use illegal drugs, or they're soliciting, controlled substances, or they have inflicted serious bodily injury on another person. we can remove them without a manifestation determination review for up to 45 days. So, in other words, again, weapons, drugs, physical assault, we can remove them for up to 45 days without a manifestation determination review. Now, within those 45 days, we need to make sure that we are continuing to provide them educational services. And what's written into law is that they have to have access to the general education curriculum. Now, for example, we realize like a science lab, you are not going to be able to recreate a full chemistry lab within an interim alternative educational setting, but do they at least have access to those curricular materials? And then within that 45 days, then that is where, we would be working closely with the threat assessment team and the special education team then to determine, you know, what do we need to do in order to meet their needs? Is it appropriate after that 45 days to return them back to their least restrictive environment? Or again, were these behaviors serious enough where they pose a threat and therefore another alternative educational setting might be more warranted for longer term? So there are specifically situations where, in real serious cases where we do not have to wait to do the MDR, we can remove them to that interim setting. And then there's protocols according to law that must be followed in order to make a determination, what needs to happen next with their educational programming. One of the other questions that has come up more recently. And actually, this was because a state Department of Ed was telling a school district that they needed to integrate the safety plan into the IEP. And I was like, what? No. We do not integrate safety plans into IEPs because they have a very different focus, although they can complement each other. An IEP is really focused on that individualized instruction, support, services, and accommodations needed to meet their academic needs. A safety plan is more focused on those safety initiatives for both that individual, but also keeping the entire school community safe. The focus of an IEP is on those academic and those social emotional skills needed to access their free and appropriate education. So, for example, social skills instruction, regulation, skills, academic skills. Whereas the focus of a safety plan is really focusing on the specific actions necessary to mitigate risk. So we might be increasing monitoring and supervision. We might be modifying schedules. There might be a no contact order. We might be doing some check in, check out for a period of time. But the focus of that safety plan is different. Also, with an IEP, anytime you want to make even the slightest change, you have to go through an IEP review, which means the parents are a part of that. We pull the whole team together. We might need to do some additional assessments. Then everybody has to agree to the change. That takes a lot of time. Whereas the safety plan needs to be flexible. So if they make improvements, we can fade supports. If they need more, supports, we can increase those supports. If they're going on a field trip, we might need to update the safety plan to address that. So we cannot go through a complex process each time. We need to make some adjustments on the safety plan. In addition, the IEP, based upon FERPA, really that information, it's confidential. It's only available to those that are on that IEP team and those that have a legitimate need to know in order to provide educational services. A safety plan may involve community partners, our SROs, our safety and security, other individuals in the building that are responsible for supervision. It's a much broader audience. So these two are separate but complementary. So the IEP is going to be reflecting more what are those educational services and the skills we need to build. Whereas that safety plan is really what are the supports needed to keep themselves, everybody else safe, and the supports needed to be able then to access some of those educational services. So we are not recommending at all that the safety plan be formally integrated into the IEP, although you might see some components where there is some slight overlap. Yeah, and that's after consultation with multiple other school safety centers and Department of Eds and the National Association of School Psychologists.
And thank you so much for joining us today and discussing this important topic and really delving into some of the intricacies of it.
Thank you so much for having me.
We again want to thank Dr. Melissa Reeves for joining us on this conversation, reflecting special education and its intersection with school threat assessment. If you want to delve further into this, please refer back to our School Threat Assessment Toolkit located on nc2, that's the number, s.org. And a reminder that there is an importance in reviewing a student's IEP and 504 plan during a threat assessment to be mindful of any interventions or supports already in place. And again, although disproportionate referrals may be a cause for concern, the goal of threat assessment is to prevent disproportionate disciplinary outcomes. And research has shown that when schools do not use threat assessment, the outcome for students who make a threat is that they are much more likely to be suspended or transferred from school. Threat assessment teams can take a problem-solving approach rather than a punitive approach and follow standard procedures performing a threat assessment. These steps protect students from this inappropriate discipline by objectively analyzing the context of the situation. Thank you again for joining us.